Winning Catalan patterns you must know. That's what we'll be speaking about in today's episode, folks. White to play. Let's start with this example to set the context. Vasily Smyslov with white pieces. There's a winning positional move in this position that directly connects to what we'll be speaking about in today's episode. We have this Catalan bishop on g2. And we want to keep this c8 bishop as terrible as possible. That's the first positional chunk you must internalize it as Catalan players. Okay? How do you keep the bishop buried on c8? And you're a great player if you found Smyslov's move e5. e5 is the winning positional move. It not only activates your bishop, Catalan bishop, and turns it into a monster on this diagonal, but it also stops black from playing e5 and activate their bad bishop on c8. If you make the automatic move rook c1, then black is very close to equality after the move e5, right? Not only stopping white from pushing e5, but also getting this bishop active on this diagonal. Beautiful multi-purpose move e5, and Smyslov got himself a winning advantage already from this position. We'll be talking about it very soon, but this sets today's context, and this is the first positional pattern that I want to highlight today. Huge in Catalan opening to know those structures, because you might say queens are off the board. It's a symmetrical pawn formation. What kind of advantage you're talking about? And that's exactly why we begin with this very position. Beautiful piece activity, limited pieces, disconnected rooks, extra space. If you had all these small advantages, white already got himself a winning advantage. How do we come to that position? Let's show some moves. Not deep analysis of every single move. I want you to connect to those recurrent middle game ideas, folks. That's a Catalan structure. The bishop goes to this diagonal, obviously, and white welcomes this exchange on c4, which also opens the scope for the bishop even more. At some point, we will get the pawn back. Smyslov gets the pawn instantly in this position with queen a4 to c4, and here you see we will soon arrive in a very symmetrical formation. a6 is a very typical idea. They want to go b5 tempo, followed up with bishop b7. Black usually equalizes if all goes well, if they can get the bishop on this long diagonal, if they don't leave a backward pawn on c7. We will also talk about that very soon in today's episode, folks. So Smyslov anticipates b5. That's why he drops back the queen to c2. Well, black should have played b5 most likely. They go c takes d4, and now we are reaching symmetrical pawn formation. What's the problem? The problem is the bishop on c8. Never forget that, folks. Now black cannot play b5 anymore because the bishop's activity, and now the entire game revolves around white's Catalan bishop versus the bishop on c8. I want you to focus on the big picture in this game. Just look how white exchanged all the pieces, even the queens, to ultimately reach a position where he was playing against the bishop on c8. This is the first point to highlight from this example. Look how Smyslov is playing. He buries the knight on e7 with this pawn move. He activates the bishop on this long diagonal. Even the knight gets active on c4. And here we are back to the first position very soon after knight c6, folks. Can you remember this position? Symmetrical pawn formation, endgame without the queens. It looks black is very close to equality, and then comes e5. And we see nagging, long-term Catalan pressure. That's why it's called Catalan torture sometimes, because white's advantage is long-term. Black has no easy way to completely equalize those positions for the reasons mentioned. Also very difficult to play for black. f6, Smyslov doesn't take on f6, which would ultimately allow black in pushing e5, right? For example, they can play e5 on the next turn. Thus, Smyslov keeps the pawn on e5. Why? Because the bishop remains to be a buried piece. Rook b8, rook c1. He gets ready for the c-file pressure. So after rook c1, they take on e5, and Smyslov takes back with the knight. He welcomes further exchanges. Black's main problem remained. Please focus on this, guys. The art of exchanging pieces. By exchanging of black's active pieces, Smyslov left black with a buried bishop on c8 and highlighted the main advantage even more. Now rook c7 is also coming, the 7th rank invasion. This game is already finished positionally. I will show you how we converted. There are many moves for white that win in this position, many winning plans. Bishop h3, to potentially highlight this problem on e6 and disallow moves like bishop b7 in his position. And after this, he goes rook f1. He is exchanging off black's only active piece in his position and leave them with those terrible creatures on the queen side. Instant threat is takes, bishop takes e6 check, thus king f8, and now Smyslov, being endgame virtuoso, he goes rook a7 to attack the guy as well. Well, he doesn't take on a5 directly because this will allow rook c6. The final beautiful moment in the entire game. Beautiful technical move from Vasily Smyslov. He doesn't want to allow rook c6. He goes bishop g2. Bam! Multi-purpose move. There is no rook c6. The rook is a buried creature. This pawn is not going anywhere. The bishop is terrible. By the way, bishop g2 also stuffs bishop b7, guys. Can you see? Can you see how world champion plays chess? How he says no to the extra pawn because that will give black those ideas? That's beautiful. Bishop g2, full control again. Catalan bishop kills the bishop on c8 and the game is beautiful in the end. b3 also stops black's ideas of playing a4. He's stopping bishop c4 and so on and so on. The rook is terrible. The bishop has not much function on a6. If the bishop moves, then this is dropping anyhow. Black is desperate. He tried a pawn sacrifice, but of course, Smyslov calculates further. Nobody's stopping the pawn on a7, supported by the Catalan bishop on g2. Beautiful calculation. Well, takes. The pawn is not going anywhere because of bishop e4, stopping the pawn, and black resigned in his position. So this was the first, let's say, important pattern to be internalized as Catalan players. If someone asks you, summarize your opening with a single sentence, I would say we should definitely start with this beautiful bishop versus black's bad bishop. Yeah, as they say, if black cannot solve their bishop problem against the Catalan, then they cannot fully equalize. This game, this first game, beautifully highlights this point. Even without the queens, in a simplified context, white's long-term advantage is so visible. But if you allow e5 by a routine move, then black is solving their problem almost instantly. So never forget this, guys. That's your Catalan bishop and you want to play against the bishop on c8 in general. Second pattern from one of my own games. I played the Catalan almost my whole life, so I will show off slightly and show you a rapid game of mine that I played around 5 years ago. Online rapid game, okay? I play queen c2 to support e4 while also guarding my pawn on c4. Black is sort of choosing the Catalan close Catalan so far. Again, the problem is the bishop on c8 and I want to keep them as such. e4 is a very important pattern as well. Of course, you know it as Catalan players. The main function of the queen, as I said, was also supporting the break e4, which will also activate the bishop on g2, of course. e4, takes. Black goes knight f6. The queen drops back to e2. Very good move. You're still stopping black from pushing e5, which would activate the bishop on c8. Very standard move, queen e2. Also, rook d1 can come at some point to fight against c5 or e5 pawn breaks. But I would say e5 is the main concern because that will activate the bishop. It will make it much more difficult for black to play e5. And look at those beautiful pawn center, controlling all these key central squares, stopping knight e5s, and so on and so on. White already has a long-term nagging pressure in his position. Bishop f4 attacks the rook. Bishop d6 comes one more pattern here, guys. After queen takes d6, I want you to also stop the video and find a beautiful pattern for white that you play against the bishop on c8 ultimately. If you give time to black, they will slowly play moves like c5, takes, followed by b6 and bishop b7, and they will neutralize your Catalan bishop this way, okay? The queen is supporting the c5 pawn break from d6. That's why we are engaging in this beautiful move c5. Very typical and standard in those Catalan positions. It looks ugly at first sight because you're giving this d5 outpost to black, but look at the advantages. You're completely playing now against the bishop on c8. This move indeed is designed to bury the bishop on c8 and disallow black from playing c5 themselves. Multifunctional move, stopping c5, and the game plan becomes obvious. Plus, there's one more point to this move. You also create this outpost on d6 for your knight. Can you see it, guys? Knight e5, c4, d6 is coming at some point, and you will create an octopus on d6. That's why advantages outweigh the costs of such moves on c5. Okay, c4, c5, very typical, very standard Catalan pattern for you, which you must know. I play the move, of course, instantly because I have this stored in my long-term memories. I won so many similar games using the same template before in my life as well, guys. Knight e5, highlight this point. The final point of giving up d5 is at any point, if you want, you can chop off that knight on d5 if it ever reaches that square, okay? But black cannot solve their bishop problem in this position. Knight c4, highlighting knight d6 ideas. Can you see it, guys? Okay, knight d6 directly, jumping to the outpost, and the bishop is the main problem. Rook c1, I was not in a hurry. Queen a5, a3 defending the pawn. Very quickly, I'll just show you guys. By the way, there is no hurry with such captures. You can always do it later on, right? We can always do the exchange later on. That's their only active piece, but that's not stable on that point. So there's no rush. First, we improve every single piece. Knight c4, queen c7, queen e5. One more typical pattern, the art of exchanging pieces. That's black's only active piece, you might say. So my queen trade will also simplify the position to highlight their bad bishop problem even more, right? When the enemy has a buried piece, then usually exchanging of all of their other pieces are helping us because we isolate that buried bishop even more. I created a course about this, the art of exchanging pieces. Now I also open the D file just in case I also have such ideas later on. The bishop is a tall pawn and there is no easy way out for black to activate the bishop. I took on f6 to go rook e1 and attack the pawn. There are many different ways for white to play this position, by the way, guys. He should have played e5 in this position, but after knight d6, it's still very hard for black to find the move. Bishop e6 will be answered by f4, and the rook's activity is so visible in this position, right? Otherwise, the rook is tied down on that square. There is no rook e8 because of the knight on d6. It's still a very good position for white. You can even pile up against the knight on d5. That's why he played f5, but f5 is also quite weakening, quite terrible positionally, of course, giving up the e5 square altogether. I chopped off that knight. I invaded the 7th rank ultimately with my rook, and this game is over. Again, never forget, the bishop is the main problem, and the game was totally finished. Took on b6, and this problem on c6 remained. If they take this way, I simply exchange those rooks and come up with this idea of entering a competitive winning rook endgame. After b6, he takes b6. This game is totally finished, and I won the game easily, guys. So you see, after queen e2, e5 was never possible to activate the bishop. Yes, black could go c5 in this position. The problem with c5 is that your Catalan bishop is gaining more scope. That's a good thing for your Catalan bishop. Plus, the bishop still needs so much time to neutralize our bishop. It will never even happen. You can simply play rook d1 and align with the black queen. And now, problems for black. If they go queen c7, this invites bishop f4 tempo moves. And if they go queen b6, then they are getting in the way of their plan of b6 and bishop b7. And the bishop remains to be a terrible piece. Bishop b3 will align with the queen on b6. And white keeps a long-lasting advantage in those positions. So look at the big picture. We are still playing against a terrible bishop on c8, and our claim is that our bishop is a better piece in the long run. And if black gets ready for those ideas in the long run, then you say, no. Play c5, but those multifunctional ideas, we learned so many patterns here, right? Even knight d6 pattern was shown in this position. This pattern is also quite nice. We can always do later. There is no hurry with this exchange. So first you improve your pieces and then you decide on the right moment of chopping off that knight. Just to show you how the same pattern applies to different positions, I will show you a game of Sasha Grischuk with the white pieces. Of course, a great grandmaster, super grandmaster Grischuk applies the pattern that I showed you, okay? Again, very similar structure. Knight d2 is coming, e4 is coming on the next turn. Takes, queen takes e4. Bishop b7. In the first game we saw this, but now they play bishop b7 directly. The good thing is this, guys, there is no c5 because the bishop will be hanging in that line. So Sasha first aligns with the queen on d8. Very typical pattern as well. You see, because black's main breaks are these two pawn breaks, so you basically anticipate them and prevent them by also improving your rook on d1. Rook c8, bishop f4, very nice move, connecting your rooks. The bishop is a very active piece on that spot. Queen c2. In my game, we looked at queen e2. That's also a very good move. Queen c2 in those positions. Never forget, there is no c5 because this alignment would hurt black. So they need to waste some time to prepare c5. That's why they play bishop d6. You take, and then it's your turn, guys. Can you guess Grischuk's move in this position? There are two ways to stop c5 for black. Of course, that's their main intention. They want to go c5 and liberate their bad bishop. And you're a great player if you want Sasha's move c5. Same pattern as I showed you. Multifunctional move, stopping c5 and burying the bishop on a6 while getting tempo on the queen, plus creating this d6 outpost for his knight. Even knight e5 was good because your bishop would be stopping the move c5 in that position. They need to waste more time with the queen. Now you can go c5 and shut down the bishop even more. That's also a very nice move for white in this position. But Sasha plays c5 directly, and after queen e7, he simply plays b4. The entire game plan is revolving around the bishop on b7, the art of burying pieces, guys. If you go bishop a6, the problem is there's nothing going on this diagonal, plus the bishop also leaves this pawn as a clear target. At some point we'll play knight e5 and attack the pawn. We can even go a4 to claim more space, and so on and so on. White has a clear advantage, not to mention rook b1 and b5 ideas. We have clear play on the queen side as well for white. Okay, before knight d5 was the game continuation, sort of resembles the game I showed you guys, my own game. Rook b1, couple of ideas, at some point even supporting b4, b5 ideas for white, defending the pawn on b4. He's not in a hurry. They go b5 in the actual game. The problem is the bishop is truly becoming a tall pawn. Please guys, look at the big picture. The bishop is shut down from the game completely, and this Catalan bishop is a much better piece. The knight is also excellent, and you'll see how Sasha wins this game. There are many different ways for white to play this. Knight e5, very standard. He's not in a hurry to chop off that knight. We can always do it later. Rook b3, sometimes rook a3 ideas, sometimes controlling c3 square is good. Sometimes rook can go to f3. Yeah, we have so much extra space for white, and that's why you can maneuver your pieces from A to B so easily for white. And look at the black pieces, completely restrained on these two ranks. They have zero activity whatsoever. Depressing position for black to play. Bishop e4, also very typical, highlighting those ideas. Sometimes you can even create a battery, queen and bishop battery on this diagonal. f6, rook f3, also nice. Eyeing this f7 square, right? Beautiful play from Sasha. Of course here, very standard Soviet sacrifice, exchange sacrifice was winning for white, but I guess Sasha did not want to even calculate those messy lines. In this line, white is so nicely winning, by the way. Queen f4, right? Double attack in those squares, and this attack will be just crushing for white. Sasha in the actual game didn't take on f6. He wanted to win the game quietly and slowly for white. Queen c1, well, he basically plays simple chess, guys. Retreating, now those ideas are coming. He wants to place a rook on the power outpost. Never forget this. They are playing without the bishop on b7. He plays bishop b3 and says, please take on d1 and exchange on my own term. Game continuation. If he takes on e5, by the way, guys, rook d6, follow it up with queen d2. Complete domination by the white pieces. This game is totally finished as well. White is completely winning in this position. In the actual game, they took on d1. Nothing changed. Rook d3, of course, exchanging on his own terms. Now queen d6 ideas are coming. Well, that's a pawn. That's not a bishop. That's a pawn. So white is the extra piece. Really, domination on d6. This game is already finished, guys. Attacking the c6 point, paralyzing black pieces, and now the final front, final weakness. That's a pawn on a6. He slowly improves his king. He has all the time in the world to take the pawn, and the game is totally finished. One more pawn is gone, and I think black resigned in his position after a4. Takes. Well, one more pawn is created. Queen a5 is also nice, creating a pass pawn, right? As you can see, black cannot hold this position, guys. He just resigned because of these invasions. He has nothing to do. The game is over. In the final segment of this video, I will show you another key pattern. Let's say, what happens if black manages to get the bishop on this long diagonal? I will show you some key games to highlight white's advantages even in those structures where black seems to be solving their bishop problem. Okay, very famous game, maybe the most famous game in the Catalan structures. Kramnik and Carlsen, well, in 2007 if I'm not wrong. It was a long time ago. Carlsen was very young when the game was played, and Kramnik, as you know, is a Catalan expert. So I'll just show you one of his games to highlight my point here. Okay, so d takes c4, queen c2, very typical way to get the pawn back. a6, queen takes c4. You can also play a4 to stop the move b5. Yeah, that's also a typical line, of course, all right? In this actual game, Kramnik plays queen c4. It looks like at first sight you're letting black to solve their bishop problem because the queen needs to move, and Magnus manages to get the bishop to this long diagonal. And here our story starts from this position. It looks like black is completely fine. They are solving all their problems. And now there's one more little problem for black. I want you to see that problem. Positionally speaking, what is a weakness in the position? What's the weak pawn that white can later target in this position? Yes, that's a pawn on c7, guys. Can you see it? That's a backward pawn on a semi-open file. That's a potential target for the white pieces. That's an annoyance for black. If they also play the move c5 freely, then black will be completely fine in those positions. But if we can stop c7, c5 pawn break, and if we can pile up on that pawn, tie down the black pieces, white can still have a nagging pressure in this position. Plus, ultimately, the structure will give us one more weakness, namely the outpost on c6. Yes, that's a weak square on c6. No black pawn can control this square anymore. Also keep that in mind. We ultimately want to implant a knight on this beautiful outpost in this position. That becomes Kramnik's game plan. That explains bishop d2 in this position, right? At some point, he may go bishop a5 to put pressure on the backward pawn, also pin that pawn on c7. Okay? Also maybe highlighting rook c1 very quickly in those positions to completely pile up and attack the weakness. Magnus plays knight c6 to stop bishop a5. Also he wants to go knight b4 very, very early on in those positions. Okay? e3. He was also attacking d4, by the way. That's a multifunctional move. e3. White plays e3. Of course, Magnus plays knight b4 because otherwise the knight will be getting in the way of the c7 pawn, right? So of course he wants to play knight b4 ASAP to attack the queen. And after takes, you might say black got the bishop pair. Black manages to get a good position. The bishop is active. So what kind of advantage are you talking about for white in this position? That's why Catalan torture is his name. Because of this backward pawn on c7, because of the outpost on c6, black did not manage to fully equalize this position. White has a central pawn. Black doesn't have a central pawn. Also, those ideas exist for white. That's why Kramnik plays a3, kick the bishop first, knight d2. Well, ultimately, the knight wants to go to b3 and maybe even use the outpost on c5. There are two outposts for white in this position. The c5 outpost and the c6 outpost. Plus, the pawn on c7 is a weak pawn. If you combine all these three things, that gives white a small advantage in this position. Okay? So, rook c8 was the game continuation. Magnus plays rook c8. The opponent's idea, folks, whenever the opponent makes a move, you must ask yourself, what would they play if I don't make a move right now? Yeah? Of course, you know it already. And you see it, guys. c5 is black's next move. If you don't react right now, Magnus will play c5 and the game is completely turning into black's favor because they are managing to get rid of the backward pawn and they will be having a bishop pair and so on and so on. So this move must be stopped by white. Must be stopped. And that's why Kramnik played the move b4, guys. Very typical pattern, clamping on the c5 square and preventing the move c5. If you give more time to white, we will even play those moves, of course, right? On the queen side. See, the opponent's intentions are crucial for chess calculations. b4. Well, Magnus plays a5 logically because if he keeps on waiting, guys, if he keeps on waiting, like making slow moves, we will play knight b3 to c5, maybe sometimes to a5 and c6 and so on and so on. Queen e2 is a possibility as well. Knights are defending each other. You're offering a bishop trade. Ultimately, right, these squares and this pawn on c7 is killing black. White has a long-lasting advantage on the queen side. Black can never equalize completely. Thus, he plays a5. He wants to disturb the clamping pawn on b4. If Kramnik will take on a5, Magnus has time to play c5 and he's completely turning this game upside down in its position because the queen also hits the pawn and he's, well, activating all of their pieces. That's why Kramnik doesn't take on a5. He plays a very cunning move, knight e5, very typical Catalan pattern. You invite the bishop trade. It looks like you're allowing the trade. You're getting rid of your Catalan bishop in this position. So what did white gain in return? I told you guys. Can you see it? This is an outpost square for the knight. The disappearance of the bishop on b7 makes this square even more weaker. Knight c6 is coming on the next turn, and this game is basically highly in white's favor. You will see a very similar position in the actual game. Please look at the beautiful knight on c6, and this is a backward pawn. That's a bad rook. These are the ideas for white. That's a weakness on b5 as well. White has a long-lasting advantage in this position. So after knight e5, Magnus played the move knight d5 in the actual game. He should have taken on g2, by the way. And this was the best move anyhow for black in this position. But instead he plays knight d5. Well, it looks logical because he puts pressure on the pawn on b5. Looks like it's forcing Kramnik's hands in his position. But then comes knight b3. He doesn't care about the pawn on b4, guys. Kramnik has a very cunning idea behind. A takes b4, he doesn't take back. He plays knight a5. A tempo move on the loose bishop on b7, plus he's eyeing this outpost on c6. Can you see it, guys? Those knights are connecting on this outpost on c6 in this position. So after bishop a8, he does go knight c6, hitting the queen and the bishop as well. After takes, white replaces that knight with a beautiful piece with tempo on the queen. And in this position, if you take on b4, black will recapture on b4. Thus, Kramnik first chops off the active knight on d5. You can't take back with the queen because of the fork on e7. And after he takes d5, he simply takes back on b4. He regains the pawn in his position. And look at this position, guys. Amazing knight on c6 versus not a good bishop on e7 plus rook a5 ideas are there. That's a clear weakness on b5. That's a clear weakness on c7. Pawn structure wise, white is much better and he got himself a dominating position. Nobody can chase away that knight on c6, killing all these rooks as well. And this game is highly in white's favor. He won the game very easily from this position. Rook a5, I can show you all the way until the end. Magnus was helpless here. Knight e5 back. White's enjoying this game so nicely. Now the pawn has to go because there is no way for the queen to defend the pawn. And then extra pawn for white. He wants to activate some pieces. It's not enough at all. Queen c7, right? Bishop b6, queen a5. Guarding the pawn. Once bishop b4 was on the board, guys, what should we do? Can we exploit the loose rook on b8? And yes, Kramnik plays a very good move, rook b1. If you take my queen, you get mated after the sequence, right? This game will be over. So Magnus is helpless after rook b1. White is completely winning this position. He tried queen d6. So after queen a4, Magnus Carlsen resigned in his position. Black was down a pawn for no compensation. That's a weakness. That's a weakness as well. And white was just completely crushing this position. So what's the big lesson? Even though the bishop seems to be solving its problem, it's neutralizing our bishop on g2, black's problems remain in this pawn structure. Namely, outpost on c5, outpost on c6, and a backward pawn on c7. You see? That's why Catalan is a very annoying opening for those black players. They cannot easily equalize if you're careful. If you slip and if you make a routine move in this position, then c5 is on the board and it's black who is suddenly better. Because after, let's say, takes, please observe the situation, guys. There is no more outpost on c5. There is no more outpost on c6. And there is no more backward pawn on c7. That's why black is completely fine. And even the bishop pair is shining in its position in black's favor. But after b4, clamping on the queen side, highlighting all of their problems, our long-term Catalan torture remains. And also finally, look how he was using tactics in this position to achieve his strategic goal. That tempo on the bishop was crucial to establish a beautiful knight on c6. He doesn't shy away from exchanging off his Catalan bishop as well because the king is so safe on the king side. Black is in no means to attack the king on g1 and is winning the game easily on the queen side. This will be your homework position, folks. There are so many more Catalan patterns that I will later show you, but I think it's enough for this video that we stop here because of those 3 key patterns that I show you that always connects to a central theme, right? So we didn't digress too much. We were focusing on the good Catalan bishop versus a bad bishop, and we want to keep it as such. I even saw some patterns where even after the bishop gets to this long diagonal, black's problems remain. That's what I usually start in learning an opening. I look at the big picture. I look at the big philosophies, right? What is in general my plan in those positions that I want to do? So this gives me a basic idea to learn the spirit of a certain opening. And I think it's a very good place to start when understanding deeply what the Catalan is all about. I think it's a very good place to start to compare these 2 bishops in those structures and connect our moves to this why information. Okay? White to play. Please tell me a move for white that is very good in this position. Also, does it work? Use some tactical vision, use some tactics to justify the move. There's one positionally desirable move for white in this position that looks unplayable at first sight. So calculate some lines, please, and tell me whether that move works for white or maybe it doesn't. If it doesn't, also let me know, okay? And I'll give you feedback in this position. And with a certain evaluation of the resulting position as well. Catalan deeply lies in my heart. I played almost my entire life. I connected to those why information. I want to diversify the middle game plans, ideas by looking at those master games. And hopefully I did my best to break down key Catalan patterns for you. Of course, given your feedback, I may do future videos to diversify our pattern knowledge in this beautiful opening that many black players hate to face, honestly, including me. I will see you on the next episode. If you like the video, folks, please give me a like and subscribe and share it with a friend that is also maybe playing the Catalan opening. See you soon.